The prairie wind, a constant, mournful voice, whipped dust devils around the lone cabin. Jedediah leaned against the porch post, squinting at the horizon. The sun beat down, but expectation chilled him more effectively than any frost. He'd built this life, this sturdy log walls and hard-won patch of earth, on the promise of a partnership. A mail-order bride. The stage was late. Every minute stretched, a taut wire in the oppressive silence. He imagined her. Capable hands, a steady gaze, perhaps a quiet laugh to fill the emptiness that echoed within the cabin walls. He hadn't asked for beauty, only fortitude and willingness. He needed a wife, a helpmate in this unforgiving land. A faint speck appeared on the distant trail, growing slowly, agonizingly, into a wagon. Relief warred with a nervous tremor in his gut. This was it. The wagon drew closer, pulled by two weary horses. It wasn't the grand carriage he'd half imagined, but a sturdy, practical vehicle, piled high with bundles and boxes. As it creaked to a halt before the cabin, Jedediah pushed off the post, smoothing down his work-roughened shirt. His heart gave a strange, sharp lurch. There was no woman sitting beside the driver. Instead, the wagon bed seemed alive, a tangle of small bodies, peering out like frightened field mice. Children, not one or two but a multitude. One by one, they clambered down, some stumbling, others wide-eyed and still. They ranged in age from toddlers barely able to walk to a tall, thin girl who looked perhaps 16 or 17. Her face smudged with dust and weariness, her arms already corralling the younger ones. 8 of them. Jedediah stood frozen, the hopeful smile he'd prepared dying on his lips. The driver, a grizzled man smelling of horses and dust, cleared his throat. "Jedediah Stone?" he rasped. Jedediah nodded, finding his voice a rough croak. "That's me," the driver gestured with his whip towards the cluster of children, now huddled together near the wagon wheel. "They came on with me from the railhead, said they was bound for here, left off by circumstances. This here," he indicated the tall girl with a tilt of his head, "says she's Eleanor Vance." Oldest Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze meeting Jedediah's with a mixture of defiance and raw vulnerability that sent a jolt through him. Her eyes, a startling blue beneath a curtain of tangled brown hair, held the wisdom of years beyond her age. "Sir," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite a tremor in her hands. "Mr. Vance, our father, arranged for us to come. To Mrs. Vance," her voice faltered slightly on the last name. Jedediah felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "Mrs. Vance?" he repeated, the words slow and disbelieving. "The woman I was meant to marry was named Clara Vance." Eleanor nodded, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "Our mother. She passed, sir. Before we left, a suffocating silence fell. 8 children, a dead bride." Jedediah stared at the small faces, then at Eleanor, her shoulders squared, trying to project a strength she clearly didn't fully possess. This wasn't a partnership. This was a burden, dropped onto his doorstep like a foundling in a blizzard. Eleanor's gaze swept over the bare cabin, the vast, empty land stretching in every direction. Despair, sharp and sudden, pierced through her attempt at composure. Where else was there to go? They had spent weeks traveling, relying on the kindness of strangers and the last of their father's dwindling funds. Their mother's sickness had taken everything, including her. Eleanor had promised her she would keep them together, find a home. This isolated cabin and this stern-faced man were their last hope. But his face, it wasn't welcoming. It was shocked, disbelieving, and hardening into something that looked like rejection. The youngest child, a boy with tear-streaked cheeks, whimpered and clutched at her skirt. Eleanor automatically reached down, her hand finding his small head. Her eyes pleaded with the man before her, a silent appeal that spoke volumes of their destitution, their complete reliance on his mercy. Jedediah looked from the children to Eleanor, then back to the empty wagon. The driver shifted uncomfortably. "My job's done, mister," he mumbled. "Need to head back." He didn't wait for a reply, climbing back onto the wagon seat and snapping the reins. The wagon creaked away, leaving Jedediah, Eleanor, and 8 silent children standing in the dust. The sun beat down. The wind howled its lonely song. Jedediah ran a hand over his face, the grit of the prairie dust suddenly feeling heavy, suffocating. This was not the future he had planned. It was chaos, responsibility he hadn't asked for. A house meant for 2 now faced with the impossible task of sheltering 10. He looked at Eleanor again. Really looked at her. Not a child, not truly. A young woman already bearing the weight of too much grief and responsibility. Her jaw was set, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a fierce, protective intensity that surprised him. He saw not just a girl, but a shield, standing between her vulnerable siblings and the harshness of the world. His initial shock began to give way to a grudging acknowledgement of the sheer impossibility of her situation, and the uncomfortable truth of his own. He was alone, they were alone. The prairie didn't care about broken plans or dead wives. It only cared about survival. The following days were a blur of noise and clumsy adjustment. Jedediah's small cabin, built with quiet solitude in mind, was suddenly overflowing. Children tripped over each other, their small voices, once a distant hope, now a constant, demanding chorus. Jedediah moved through his days like a man navigating unfamiliar terrain, his stoic mask firmly in place. He said little, his instructions brief and direct. Eleanor watched him constantly, interpreting his silence, trying to anticipate his needs, desperate not to give him a reason to send them away. She had quickly assessed their situation. Their survival depended entirely on this man's tolerance. She pushed down her own grief and fear, focusing every ounce of her energy on managing the children. She established routines, finding water from the well, building a fire, rationing the meager supplies they had brought, keeping the younger ones from wandering off into the vast, empty landscape. Her hands, though young, were capable. She washed clothes in a bucket, scrubbed the single pot until it shone, swept the dirt floor. She worked from dawn until she collapsed onto her straw-filled pallet at night, surrounded by sleeping siblings. Jedediah watched her. He saw the dark smudges under her eyes, the way she flinched when one of the toddlers cried out, the fierce protectiveness in her gaze as she counted heads at sunset. He saw her patience, endless and quiet, as she untangled arguments or soothed scraped knees. He saw her exhaustion, visible in the slump of her shoulders, the way she leaned against the cabin wall for a brief, private moment before returning to her tasks. He didn't offer help readily. That wasn't his way. He was a man used to doing for himself, relying on no one. But sometimes his actions spoke louder than words. He brought back a rabbit from his hunting rounds, leaving it on the table without comment. He sharpened her dull knife. He showed her which berries were safe to pick near the creek. He built a small fence section to keep the smallest children contained near the cabin. Small things, given grudgingly, observed by Eleanor with a swelling in her chest that felt suspiciously like gratitude. She learned his rhythms. The time he rose, the clang of his hammer as he worked on the lean-to he was building, the way he preferred his coffee. She learned his silences had weight, and his rare words were always measured. He never spoke of his expected bride, nor did he explain why he didn't simply turn them out. Eleanor didn't dare ask. The unspoken question hung between them like the heat haze off the prairie floor. Why are you letting us stay? The children, initially terrified of the quiet, imposing man, slowly began to treat him with cautious curiosity. The youngest would sometimes toddle near where he worked, watching him with round eyes. Jedediah would ignore them for a long time, then perhaps carve a simple wooden animal from a scrap of wood and leave it where a child would find it. He never handed it to them directly. It was a negotiation, a slow, silent treaty being drawn up between the man who wanted solitude and the family thrust upon him. Eleanor saw these small acts. They were tiny cracks in his formidable reserve, glimpses of a hidden landscape beneath the stone. She started to relax infinitesimally. The crushing fear of imminent abandonment began to recede, replaced by a wary hope. This wasn't a home like the one they'd lost, filled with her mother's laughter and her father's stories. This was something else. something starker, built on necessity and unspoken arrangements. But it was undeniably shelter. And in the vast, indifferent wilderness, shelter was life itself. She still felt the weight of her responsibility, the constant pressure to keep her siblings safe and quiet, to prove their worth. But now, when the wind howled at night, rattling the cabin walls, she knew they were not entirely alone in facing it. There was another presence in the small space, silent and watchful, but no longer threatening. Weeks bled into months. The harsh beauty of the prairie summer gave way to the biting wind of autumn. The children, having nowhere else to be, slowly rooted themselves in the rhythm of the cabin and the land around it. They learned the names of the wildflowers, the scent of the coming rain, the best rocks for skipping in the creek. Jedediah continued his work, expanding the cabin, preparing for the inevitable winter. His interactions with Eleanor remained sparse, built on necessity and shared tasks. They worked side by side sometimes, mending the fence, harvesting the meager garden patch, chopping wood. The air between them was rarely filled with chatter, but with the sounds of their labor, the thud of the axe, the scrape of the hoe, the rustle of leaves. In these moments of shared work, a different kind of communication occurred. Eleanor learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the set of his jaw. Jedediah, she knew, was watching her too, observing her tireless efforts, her quiet competence, the way she handled the inevitable squabbles and needs of her siblings with unwavering patience. He saw her strength, not the physical kind he possessed, but a deep, inner resilience that mirrored the tenacity required to survive on this land. He saw the fierce love that drove her, the sheer will to keep her small flock together. He never praised her, never acknowledged her burden directly, but his actions continued their quiet commentary. He made sure the woodpile was always stocked. He checked the cabin roof for leaks before the first snow. He taught the older boys how to set simple snares. He was becoming, in his own reserved way, a silent guardian. Eleanor, in turn, began to see the man beneath the stoic exterior. She saw the calluses on his hands, the lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting at distant horizons. She saw the gentleness, surprising in its contrast to his gruffness, when he interacted with the smallest children, lifting one onto his shoulder for a better view of a hawk, or letting another hold his hammer for a moment. He didn't smile often, but when he did, it was a rare and genuine thing, lighting up his face in a way that transformed it. She found herself anticipating his return from hunting, listening for the familiar sound of his horse's hooves. The cabin felt safer, more solid when he was there. The fear that had been her constant companion began to ebb, replaced by a burgeoning sense of belonging. This wasn't the family she'd lost, but it was becoming a family nonetheless, forged in hardship and silent mutual respect. One evening, a fierce storm blew in, earlier and more violent than expected. The wind howled like a wolf pack, rattling the cabin walls, threatening to tear the roof off. Rain lashed against the windows. Inside, the younger children cried, frightened by the fury outside. Eleanor gathered them close, singing soft, shaky lullabies. Jedediah moved calmly through the cabin, checking the shutters, reinforcing the door. Their eyes met across the flickering lamplight. There was no need for words. They were together in this, facing the storm as a unit. It wasn't the climax she might have imagined. No dramatic rescue. No grand declaration. It was simply facing the shared vulnerability of their situation. Together, in the flickering, uncertain light. And in that shared vulnerability, a bond was quietly, irrevocably strengthened. The storm raged, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of calm settled, the calm of people who knew they were not alone. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and shivering in the sudden cold. The air held the sharp scent of coming snow. The shared ordeal, simple as securing a cabin against wind and rain, had subtly but fundamentally altered the atmosphere within its walls. The tension that had hummed thick between Jedediah and Eleanor dissipated, replaced by a quiet understanding. They had faced a threat together, not as man and ward, but as two people responsible for the safety of others. Jedediah's silences no longer felt impenetrable. Eleanor found herself speaking more freely, discussing the children's needs, asking his opinion on matters she would have tackled alone before. He, in turn, listened, his responses still brief but considered. He began to include her in decisions about the cabin, about supplies, about preparing for winter. It was a partnership, nascent and unspoken, but undeniable. He started teaching her practical skills he'd assumed she wouldn't need to know. How to load a rifle, how to read the weather signs in the sky, how to treat minor injuries with herbs from the land. He taught her not just for her own survival, but for the collective survival of their unexpected household. Eleanor absorbed it all, her determination hardening into quiet competence. She was no longer just trying to keep her siblings alive. She was helping to build a future, however unforeseen it was. She saw the subtle shifts in Jedediah too. The way he would pause his work to watch the children playing, a hint of something soft in his gaze. The way he would ensure the youngest had an extra blanket at night. He never spoke of her mother, or the life they'd lost, but his acceptance of the life they had found together was evident in every quiet action. The cabin, once a symbol of Jedediah's solitude and Eleanor's desperate refuge, became something else. It was a home, filled not with the easy warmth of a conventional family, but with the hard-won comfort of resilience and shared purpose. The children's laughter echoed in the rooms, no longer a jarring intrusion, but a natural sound of the space. Eleanor watched her siblings thrive under the unexpected stability. The fear slowly drained from their faces, replaced by the simple preoccupations of childhood. And seeing their peace, Eleanor felt her own spirit begin to mend. She was still young, the weight of responsibility immense, but she was no longer buckling under it. She stood taller, her gaze steady, meeting Jedediah's with quiet confidence. They hadn't found the lives they expected. Jedediah hadn't found a bride. Eleanor hadn't found a substitute mother or father figure for her siblings. Instead, they had found each other, two solitary figures brought together by circumstance and bound by the vulnerability of the 8 small lives entrusted to their care. It was a family built not on blood or marriage vows, but on the bedrock of necessity, respect, and the quiet understanding forged in shared hardship. Resilience wasn't just about enduring. It was about adapting, about finding strength in unexpected alliances, about building a future from the scattered pieces of the past. The prairie wind still blew, cold and relentless, but within the sturdy log walls of the cabin, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was the warmth of belonging, of purpose, of finding family in the most improbable place. Eleanor looked out at the vast, empty landscape, no longer feeling small and lost, but anchored. This was their life now. Hard, yes, uncertain always, but faced together. And in that simple truth, there was a quiet, profound hope.